Sex, gender, and how the hell did we get here? I just got finished watching Maria McLaughlin's latest video called How Not to Define Gender, and it got me thinking about how sex has become gender and how gender has become gender identity. Where and how did these notions turn from clear and well-defined to intentionally ambiguous? And how has a movement based on intentional ambiguity been able to capture just about every English-speaking country to the degree that it has? How are leaders, politicians, the media, legal entities, etc., able to make statements, create policy, render legal judgments, and create narratives based on such ill-defined ideas? When I was a child, and well into my adulthood, the word gender was a synonym for biological sex. There was never any doubt that when you referred to someone's gender, you were talking about the person's biological sex. No ifs, ands, or buts. Maybe it's because the word sex refers not only to human anatomy, but also to the act of sex, that gender was a less embarrassing term to employ. But at some point, the word gender developed a life and meaning of its own and is now completely divorced from the notion of biological sex, except when certain folks intentionally manipulate it to sometimes mean gender identity and sometimes mean biological sex when it suits them to do so. Other folks, like Dave Chappelle, unintentionally confuse the two terms, not in order to manipulate it, but because they, like me, are old school and retain the old school definition of gender as being indistinguishable from biological sex. So this video, Gender, Sex, and How the Hell Did We Get Here, is an attempt on my part to examine more deeply how all of this confusion came to pass and where in the evolution of ideas and language things went so terribly awry. In the beginning, as babies, we observe, we eat, we sleep, we poop, and we observe. I want to show you a sweet little newborn. Sorry, I'm not really good at doing videos. So here we have a little baby. So look at this sweet little newborn. The little dude is not even an hour old, and is he ever observing, taking in his new surroundings, trying to make sense of it, collecting information, recording it, collating it, storing it, creating his own little newborn database. That's just cuteness overload right there. As we grow, we notice certain patterns. And because we are members of the human community, we especially notice patterns in people. Very early on, we recognize that humans fall into two categories. We might not have words for those categories, but we recognize them and developed an instinct for which is which. As we grow into childhood and our observations become more fine-tuned, we notice even more patterns regarding these two categories of humans for which we now have come to know as boys and girls. We may notice that boys and girls present themselves differently. Maybe with respect to hairstyle, maybe clothes, maybe a preference for certain colors, certain games at recess. We may notice that boys and girls speak in slightly different registers, respond to their environment in slightly different ways, respond to other boys and girls in different ways. The differences may not be stark, and they may not be present in 100% of individuals, but they are present with enough regularity to allow a child to further distinguish one category from another, even though those differences may be nuanced. Now, times have changed since I last stepped into an elementary school 45 years ago, but I'm pretty sure I could peg male and female students to a high degree of accuracy, if not 100%. Now I want to think about gender roles and the idea of having an affinity with one set of gender roles more than with another. What I just described a minute ago with respect to tendencies in terms of appearance, attitudes, preferences, behaviors, I will call gender roles, whether those roles spring from socialization or from biology. While it is no surprise that girls may have an affinity for different things than boys, there are no hard and fast rules which state that this must be the case for each and every individual. It is certainly acceptable for a boy to have greater affinity for styles, preferences, behaviors associated with girls, and vice versa. Not only is it okay, but it is to be expected and even welcome. Life would be pretty boring if people were so predictable. So there's no problem there. It's simply good old-fashioned gender nonconformity. I think the confusion begins when we take the notion of affinity and replace it with the notion of identity. Having an affinity toward a set of behaviors is like wearing a comfortable, loose-fitting garb. Having an identity based on your behaviors is like wearing a straitjacket. Once you stop talking about affinity and start talking about identity, any sort of freedom to develop your sense of self based on diverse elements is finished. Game over. Your whole identity, your idea of self, is basically cemented to a collection of gender roles and little else. I'd also like to add to this discussion the notion of gender roles as performance. That is, one performs one's gender roles. While I can see how certain things might be considered performance, I think saying that the sum of our actions is nothing more than performance is inaccurate and misleading. High school cheerleading is an example of performed girliness. The short pleated skirts, the waving of pom-poms, the dancing in front of a crowd while big burly guys do sports in the background. Yeah, that's sort of a performance. Me thinking that if I played the role of a silly, giggly, dumb blonde rather than a self-conscious, smart blonde, I'd be accepted more readily by my peers was also a conscious choice of performing a gender role. But other than that, I can think of no instance where I consciously performed femaleness, because performance implies intention, something you do consciously, purposefully. No high school girl performs riding the bus to school, doing sports, taking an exam, or having a period, for God's sake. So I think when you add the notion of maleness and femaleness as performance to the already mistaken notion of affinity as identity, things get muddled and, quite frankly, deranged very quickly.